Every day that passes gets us one step closer to the final release of Diablo 4 in June. In the meanwhile, I've decided to create a video series specifically targeting stats in the Diablo 4 experience, looking at which stats are important per class, how to min-max these, how to build the perfect end game character, and also just serving as a primer for old veteran players that are coming back to the franchise, as well as new players that are dipping their toes in for the first time with Diablo 4. During this series, we will start out sort of easy, just looking at what's new and general explanations, but eventually we will get into some deep theory crafting. So if that seems like something you might be interested in, go ahead and check out the channel for the previous episodes. But specifically today, we are looking at a new mechanic that is in the game called Lucky Hit. So first things first, let's not get it twisted. Lucky Hit is not some brand new thing which is new to us in ARPGs. It's simply something that we are already quite familiar with under a brand new name. Namely, what this is it's an on-hit chance of something happening. Most likely Blizzard chose to use this naming convention for it simply due to the fact that this allows you to essentially explain it once and just say, okay, this is what Lucky Hit is, and then from then on, whenever it is mentioned in the description of skills or abilities or affixes or anything like that, you kind of know exactly what you're dealing with, instead of having to constantly explain what on-hit chance is and how the stuff is added together and all of that. So I think it's just a way for them to essentially simplify this. Now, the next thing you also have to know is that multiple lucky hit effects can essentially stack on one another. So you could have, for instance, in the case of a barbarian, 3 weapons, each with its own lucky hit thing on it, and then when you score a lucky hit, all 3 of those effects are going to get calculated in turn. So obviously stacking multiple lucky hits and then having a very high lucky hit chance is going to work out very well, because you're going to be able to sort of have access to a whole bunch of those effects. Now, it goes without saying that if you don't have any lucky hit effects on any of your gear, then lucky hit does nothing for you. Every single ability in the game has its own lucky hit chance, which you can very easily see by turning on advanced tooltips in the game. And even though each one of them has its own lucky hit coefficient or chance or whatever you want to call it, the point is, unless you have any effects that can actually use this, that can actually proc on a lucky hit does nothing. Also worth noting is the fact that when you use an AoE that has a chance of producing a lucky hit on a group of enemies, that lucky hit chance is, and its proc is calculated individually for each target within the group. That's why you'll often see that lucky hit AoEs have a very, very low chance of happening. Otherwise, of course, AoEs would be super imba. And then last but not least, we have to look at things in the game that bounce between targets, that can pierce multiple targets, that can ricochet between targets, or channel effects that also produce lucky hits. Those lucky hits, the chance of that and every consequent tick or bounce or ricochet or anything like that uses the lucky hit chance of the very first target that it hit. So there's no diminishing chances, you know, like let's say in the case of, let's use chain lightning as example. Chain lightning has a lucky hit chance of 10%, for example, then it's 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. It doesn't go like 10, 8, 6, 4, 2 or something like that. There's no diminishing returns. It doesn't drop down anything. And this actually makes it quite powerful once again, because if you have a innately high lucky hit chance, then consequent hits will give you additional chances of proccing that. Now, getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly how lucky hit works and what you need to know about the maths that are happening underneath the hood, we're going to be using 2 examples here. We're going to be using aspect of arrow storms, which is essentially our lucky hit effect that a lucky hit will produce for us, and we're going to use penetrating shot, which is going to have a lucky hit chance of 51% baked into it. Now, when we are working out what the actual chances of this entire thing going off and happening, we kind of have to do 2 separate calculations. We have to calculate the chance of an actual lucky hit happening, which is affected by the 51% that we have on the skill, and also affected by any other pieces of gear, which I'll explain more just now, which could be adding to that lucky hit chance. And then secondly, we also need to then essentially be multiplying that with the effect that we are actually trying to trigger. In this particular case, of course, the aspect of arrow storms. Hopefully, without needlessly complicating it, let me create a test case where I can explain how the maths gets calculated and essentially how your lucky hit chance and your proc comes together to give you the final effect. Now in our particular case here, we firstly have to calculate the lucky hit chance, and we get that by looking at the lucky hit chance on the skill. In this case, we're using penetrating shot, which gives us 51% to start with, and then we have to take any other additional sources of lucky hit and we have to multiply it to that by adding those together first. What I mean by this is that you can get lucky hit from your rings. It can roll as a stat on them. It can also roll as a stat on gloves, and it can also roll as a stat on staves, which of course are used by sorcerers. Now it's entirely likely that we will be getting lucky hit from other sources as well, possibly the Paragon board or something like that, and in that case you would simply just add them to this here. But as my example here states, we start off with our 51% that we have on the skill itself, and then in brackets, because we're adding them together, we put our 2 rings. So let's say these 2 rings each have 30% on them, so that's 30 plus 30, and we put our gloves, and let's say in this example our gloves has a 10% chance on. Now once we do the maths on that, we'll see that this produces a 86% chance of a lucky hit happening. Now that's super high. That's great. That means every 10 times that you use this ability, basically 8.5 times or possibly 9 times, this effect will proc. But now to see how often arrow storms actually procs, which is what we're trying to fire off of the lucky hit, we have to then multiply this chance with the multiplier or the proc that is on arrow storms. In this particular case, that's 10%. That actually leaves us with an 8.6% chance of this effect essentially firing off. Now you can see that even on this skill itself, it mentions up to 10%, and this is obviously ways in which Blizzard are trying to rein in the power of this effect, that you can't really get it to the point where it literally fires off on every shot, because that would probably be super imba. However, there are probably going to be ways for us to try and get this as close to the limit as possible and to get those to fire off as much as possible. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, basically what you have to bear in mind is that you can stack multiple lucky hit effects across all of your gear, and that way if you can have a very high lucky hit chance, like in the example that we just created here now, you can potentially have a lot of really beneficial effects which are firing off. Now there's a huge example of these available out there, some really crazy ones, like outright killing a minion if the lucky hit goes off, some stuff that heals you, some stuff that gives you barriers, and so on and so forth. So lucky hit will definitely be something that people will focus on in some cases and try to build builds around, because they can produce really insane effects when they do actually fire off. And that's going to be it for the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. I'm busy working through a couple of more different terminologies until we get to the actual meat and potatoes of some of the most important stats that you should be focusing on per class or per build and stuff like that. But please be sure to let me know in the comments down below if some of these explanations are not technical enough, if you have any questions, anything like that. Like I said, I try to not make it too, psychopathic with the maths or anything like that, because in the end also we have to remember that this isn't really that complicated and kind of like works quite simply once you understand some of the parameters of basically how this is calculated. Nonetheless, feel free to suggest anything else that you'd like me to target in this series. I have a couple of more of these videos coming out, but it's entirely possible you might suggest something that I haven't thought of to cover, and I'd love to do it. Other than that, it's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are in the world. Until next video, fucking cheers.